So good afternoon and good morning to some of you, fellow students, professors, and friends. Welcome to the Latin America Focus Group's second panel discussion. Just to briefly introduce ourselves, we are a group of master's students at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, Florence, who are interested in governance issues that concern Latin America. The group was founded by Professor Carlos Closa, and the member students who have organized today's talk are Lucia Bosoer from Argentina, Maxence Cremades from France and New Zealand, Felipe Amoroso from Brazil, Roberto Breitman also from Brazil, and myself from Belgium, Argentina, and the UK. And today we have the honor of having Ms. Katharina Siegmann and Professor Eric Lambin with us to share their knowledge and opinions on issues surrounding agriculture and sustainable land use in Latin America. During this hour-long conversation, we will discuss the impacts of global land use changes and economic globalization on Latin America, and envision how we can reconcile agriculture and land use practices with sustainable economic growth. We will start by asking some questions to our guests. And then for those in the audience who would like to ask some questions, please feel free to post them on the chat anytime, and we will try to address them during or towards the end of the discussion. Now, to introduce our guests, Katharina Siegmann is an environmental specialist with the World Bank's Environment and Natural Resource Department based in Mexico City. She joined the World Bank in 2013 and oversees the bank's forest and REDD+ projects in Mexico, as well as forest and climate change related projects in Central America. Katharina holds a master's degree in international law and economics, and before joining the bank, she worked at the Inter-American Development Bank's Climate Change Department. Good morning to you and welcome, Katharina.
Good morning to everybody.
And our second guest is Professor Eric Lambin, a geographer and environmental scientist who divides his time between the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium and Stanford University in the US. His research tries to better understand the causes and impacts of land use changes in different parts of the world. He was awarded many prizes, including the Blue Planet Prize in 2019, and is Foreign Associate at the US National Academy of Sciences. His current research tries to understand how globalization affects global land use and how private and public regulations of land use interact to promote more sustainable land use practices. Welcome and thank you for being here, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Pleased to be here.
So we would like to start the conversation by asking both of you what your thoughts are on the damaging effects of agriculture and livestock systems on Latin American forests. How do you think we can reconcile the need to feed an ever-growing population with the urgent need for reforestation and protection of ecosystems? May we start with Eric?
Yes, that's a big question, of course, and that question has two levels. One is what to do, which actions need to be done, and the second one is how to achieve these goals. What kind of regulations need to be put in place. And let me address the first part, and I'm sure the question of regulation governance will come in the conversation. But basically, we know exactly what needs to be done, and mostly three things. One is to intensify agriculture, mostly in South America. Livestock raising extremely extensive. You have less than one animal per hectare. So it's really inefficient in the way we use land, especially when that land is taken out of tropical forest. So when you intensify, mostly by coupling livestock raising with crops, and you have this rotation system, and you produce the animal feed, and the animals fertilize the plots, you raise productivity dramatically, and therefore you are able to spare land for nature. Now, of course, this is causing a number of drawbacks, because we know as when we intensify, we make the activity more profitable, and therefore the price of meat decrease, and therefore there's more consumption of the meat, and that's what we call a rebound effect. So it needs to be coupled with regulation. The other big action that needs to be taken at the global scale is related to consumption. We always need to think about supply, production, and demand, consumption. And of course, we see already this shift in diets away from animal products. More of your generation is becoming vegan or vegetarian, and it's a very good thing. Many of us become flexitarian, we eat less meat. And we also see new technologies that produce these so-called plant-based meats. There are two big startups in the Silicon Valley, Impossible Food and Beyond Meat, that produce these hamburgers. They really look like meat, but they are not. They are completely produced based on vegetables. For one of these companies, they mostly use soybean, which is produced in South America. So that's still creating a market for agriculture in South America, but with a much, much lower ecological footprint, so much lower impact on the environment, dramatically lower in terms of land and water and pesticide and the rest. And then the third thing is just to increase the efficiency of this operation. We know there are a lot of waste in this livestock operation. More than 20–30% of what's being produced is waste along the supply chain. So just making these activities more efficient, more in terms of water use, in terms of land use, in terms of recycling some of the products, using the waste product, would also help us to decrease that footprint.
Thank you very much, Eric. And Katharina, what would be your take on this?
Yes, hello, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak at this this meeting. So I do think we already heard a pretty comprehensive global perspective on how agriculture and forestry may or may not interact and what could be done. I do think from my perspective, and that is being in the field and working with governments on how to make these concepts operational. I think we have two sides of the issue here. And one is when we want to enhance the, let's say, environmental impacts, environmental effects, and want to combine agriculture and forest land uses, we need to work around economic and legal context in the countries. We need to design projects, investments that make sense from a financial point of view for the countries, that are actually procurable, that and that these countries are able, or the government agencies are actually able to support local landholders in implementing these activities. And there I do think I come to my second point, and that is we need to see agriculture and forestry maybe not so much from a separate vision, but from the view of local landholders. And that's, I think, where the landscape perspective comes in, and that's where we can really see how both activities could interact. And there, if you want, you could pull on a slide that, in fact, the Mexican government had prepared a couple of years ago when they designed the RED intervention model. And that really shows not so much what's agriculture and what's forestry, but really shows one landscape from the perspective of local landowners. And that, at least in Mexico and Central America, could be communities, ejidos, other types of land ownership that we see, and that are deeply connected to family farming, subsistence agriculture, but also other agriculture value chains. And all of them have something in common, and that is that they are somehow connected to a forest landscapes. So when we look at this, not from a sectorial perspective, but from a landscape perspective, what I do think we can achieve at the operational level is really bringing them together, working stronger on silvopastoril, agroforestry, and really making sure that that's not separated, because for land users it isn't, or for landowners. We also help local communities then, and governments in fact, to better look at land use planning. And that could be, and that mostly is done at the national level, but really if we bring it at the local level to communities, what we achieve is helping local land users to really look at their land in a way to see what's conservation, what's agriculture use, and where the intensification that Eric already mentioned can take place at the local level, while at the same time taking stock of all the other land uses you have in your territory. Another co-benefit of that approach is really social cohesion, because we need to recognize that land use often is linked to land tenure. And you have a lot of people living in land that don't have land tenure. And that has severe impacts on the way they use natural resources and they use land. It's even connected to unsustainable land uses. And a lot of the deforestation, in fact, that we see in Mexico and Central America is linked to land tenure insecurity and to not having this solid base of planning and using your natural resources. And the last point I wanted to make under this combined vision of really the territory is that by doing that, we can really look into ways of enhancing the value of forest, because often it's agriculture use that gives short-term income for communities and local land users, while conservation and forestry is more in the long term, and sometimes in the very long term. So we can use instruments such as payment for environmental services or restoration focus that combines agriculture and forestry, really to give communities an instrument at hand that provides them with short-term incomes, but also a long-term security on their natural resources. And in that regard, I do think that some of the RED models, specifically the FCPF and ISFL, and I can speak on them later in the conversation, can be very important instruments to enhance income for local communities and to enhance the value of forests within the landscapes.
Thank you very much, Catarina. Before going forward, I would actually like to ask you both if in the projects that you were or are involved, you saw any interest groups specifically that were against these changes that you both mentioned that are really relevant to happen many times. Which would you say were like a remarkable interest group that maybe represented in a situation, a constraint for your project?
You want me to go first? Or?
Please.
Of course, you know, as Catarina said very rightly, you know, land use system, always complex integrated systems with multiple functions. And for each of these functions, you will have some stakeholders that defend either the biodiversity or the agriculture or the cropland or the livestock or the forest. So by essence, whenever you try to design some new, more sustainable land use management practices, you will encounter resistance. There will be some stakeholders that are kind of against that and that will oppose. And also there's a deep conservatism in some groups of land managers. But as Catarina said, you know, the goal is one, to create this social cohesion and negotiate some joint outcome that will find some trade-off between different ecosystem services, and then find some mechanisms to compensate any stakeholders who would be affected in a negative way through this change. So that's really the art of governance, and for land use more than for any other field, you know, because we are on the ground, on the land, with all these stakeholders having a direct impact and direct benefit from certain land uses, and somehow we need to integrate all these components.
Perfect. Catarina, do you have any points to raise about this?
Maybe to go a bit more in detail on what Eric already rightly reflected on, and that is, I think in every project we design, we need to ask ourselves, who are the stakeholders? How can we group them? What's the interest? And what we have seen on the ground is we should be very careful with making any assumptions beforehand. To give you a very concrete example, as we're trying to work with non-land tenure holders in the Mexican context, and that's a lot of women, that's a lot of young men that don't have yet received land tenure rights. There is kind of this assumption at some point that it's culturally not appropriate for them to participate, or it's very difficult. But a couple of years back, we did a behavioral science study among a multitude of indigenous communities. And in fact, what we found is that their families are highly supportive of women engaging in productive activities. However, what we see is a community norm that's very tough for women to overcome, and that is women are mothers and should be at home. So understanding stakeholders, understanding cultural context, and not basing your interventions on assumptions, but really going in the field and trying to understand the interaction helps you then to make better projects. And in this very concrete context, what we did is design a specific component on female role models. So really choosing community leaders that could engage in these activities. Now, again, that's an example of an in-community stakeholder relationship, whereas I do think we have other very severe conflicts that can link to private sector, that can link to other government interventions. And so I think there's not one stakeholder discussion, but it really depends on your intervention area, on your political context, and it really also connects on how the land use is interconnected with broader economic growth, questions within your country, and the natural resource use overall in the country.
This is super interesting, and also like two keywords I would say, negotiation and compensation, as Eric was mentioning as well, is super key in this sense. So to further explore the implementation side of things here, we would be interested to know as well your opinion on ecosystem services and how they would work in Latin America. As climate conscious economists and ecologists attempt to find ways to reconcile economic growth with responsible natural resource management, the idea of placing the financial value on ecosystem services is becoming increasingly popular. And while the capitalization of nature has the potential of reshaping finance into a tool, as Katarina already mentioned as well, for the protection of life-sustaining ecosystems, it remains a controversial approach. What is your take on putting in a price for nature and producing financial models for ecosystems? And how would you to say they should be implemented? Do you have examples of projects that you helped to design? Maybe we could start with Katarina on this one.
Yes, many thanks. And I do think two very concrete examples. And here again, I'm coming back to a point I made prior. Any of these models need to make sense for landowners. If we don't create the right incentives, if we don't make sure they actually have increased income, increased livelihoods through these interventions, then we might be up to a failure. But putting a price on ecosystem services can come from different angles. It could come from a conservation perspective, where we want to actually look at how to preserve forest area or ecosystem services such as water, but they can also come from very economic perspective. And I looked up an example that I found very interesting, and that's actually the Panama Canal. So a couple of years ago, and it's actually, I think in 2010, there was intensive rainfall in Panama, very unusual. And within 17 hours, the Panamanian agency, so the Panama Canal Agency, lost around $150 million in 17 hours due to landslides caused by these rainfalls. And that was the starting point for the Panama Canal Agency to actually look into a model that could help them to interact with landowners in the upper watershed and make sure that deforestation that actually was the underlying cause for these landslides combined with the intensive rainfalls could be stopped. So a very good example of payment for environmental services is the Greater Panama Canal watershed, where in fact it's a private entity implementing a payment for environmental services scheme to safeguard what is the country's biggest economic activity, the Panama Canal. And currently the World Bank is looking into helping Panama's Environment Ministry to actually build on that experience and expand that model. So you see, it's really a private sector and induced example. And on the other hand, we have Mexico, where you have one of the largest payment for environmental services programs, not one of the first, but currently one of the largest. And it really recognizes a broad range of environmental services, and it mainly focuses on water and on maintaining forest coverage. But what I do wanted to highlight is that it's not only paying for conservation, but in the last couple of years, we have worked from a World Bank side with the government on making sure that the payments that are made are redistributed among communities in two manners. One, in order to really make sure there are communal investments that could benefit the entire communities. And that's not only land tenure holders, but everybody that lives in these communities that are somehow linked to the forest and to the conservation area. And that could be building schools, building hospitals. So a part of the payment is mandatorily reinvested in communal investments. And the second, and that's actually the larger share of the investments, is reinvested in new conservation investments. And that was not the case prior. So prior, communities received the money and they were able to decide what they wanted to do. And that's a very valid point. But if you really want to guide integrated landscape management and conservation in the long term, you need to think about fire prevention, pest prevention, making sure that everybody in the community working in the forest has the right protective gear, and all these sorts of questions. So now, under the new way it's working, a part of the payment for environmental services is mandatorily reinvested in new conservation investments.
Yes, and I agree with what Katharina said. I think it's always very important to think in terms of policy mixes. You know, no sustainable land use can be promoted with just one policy tool. It's always a mix of command and control, incentives, standards, information, monitoring. And in that mix, clearly payments for ecosystem services do play a role. And why is that? Well, because in most cases, land is either owned by private actors or by communities. And unless you're in a complete dictatorship, you cannot impose private landowners to change completely the way they manage their land. So you can, of course, incentivize, you can provide directions, some regulations, but you need somehow to compensate. You need somehow to, you need the stick, but you need the carrot, because it's privately owned or it's owned by the communities. And that's the role of payments for ecosystem services. And the key concept behind this type of intervention is the concept of externalities. If I do something on my land, it will affect me, but it will also affect my neighbors or the world. If my land is very rich in some rare species and I cut all the trees, I will contribute to the extinction of that species. And so in order to incentivize me not to do that, somehow I need to be compensated for the service I would provide the world by maintaining the forest. So that's really the concept. you know, Katarina mentioned Panama, but the origin, the first national scale program with a payment for ecosystem services was in the northern neighbor, you know, to Costa Rica, where before the 80s, Costa Rica was the worst country in the world in terms of tropical deforestation. And your generation will be very surprised because you're born with Costa Rica being the example of a green economy with ecotourism. But when I was a student, always that was the worst case. You know, the rate of deforestation was about 2% per year, which is enormous, about 1 order of magnitude what we find in many countries today. And then in the 80s, you know, they changed these policies. They increased dramatically protected areas. But of course, you had to control all your landowners. Now they were really upset that suddenly they could not continue this extensive ranching that was destroying the forest. And so the president had this idea just to, you know, keep his constituencies quiet and say, okay, we'll compensate you, you know, we'll just give you some payment. And so that was the idea. It was just a little supplement, you know, a little carrot to help them to make this major shift in land use. And now since then, it's been largely replicated. You know, the largest program in the world is in China, and but again, you know, it's just one piece, and a pretty small piece, in fact, if you look in terms of funding, among a more complex policy mix. But that piece has some role to play in some context when you're dealing with these private landowners or these communities that need to be compensated.
Thank you very much, both. Indeed, the Costa Rica example gives us a lot of hope. Now, to go a bit deeper into governance and compliance issues, as many Latin American governments are confronted by issues such as corporate lobbying, dependency on commodities, and corruption, which all hinder the sustainable governance of natural resources, as well as compliance of international agreements and regulations. How do you think Latin American states could combat the market forces that encourage harmful land use practices, and which methods and technologies are most helpful for monitoring to ensure compliance? And here I'm thinking of remote sensing data, which I know you've both worked on. So could we start with you, Eric?
Yes, no, a very important question again. And it's very striking that mostly South America, you know, has probably the best land use regulation in the world on paper, you know, de jure, but probably the lowest compliance with this regulation. You know, if you look at a country like Brazil, you know, the forest code is absolutely outstanding and has been outstanding for many, many decades. You know, it's really, really sophisticated, but the level of compliance has been very, very, very low for a long time. And one of the reasons is that traditionally the agribusiness sector is very well organized, very, very politically powerful in the continent. I think it's probably a legacy of the colonization process, where you know, it was really these big landowners that were kind of driving this colonization. Let me, to your big question, let me probably again give the global answer, and I'm sure Katarina will dive into the more national scale answer. It looks like this is the way we've divided our task implicitly. You know, we didn't coordinate, but in Latin America, a lot of the land use are expanding and causing forest cover change, deforestation, forest degradation, are commodities that are traded globally. You know, this is soybean, this is meat, timber. In Central America, maybe fruit, pineapple, oil palm actually. Palm oil becomes a big land use, also causing a lot of change. Cacao, coffee. So these are all traded globally. And if there are many producers, there are very, very few traders, very small number of companies that are trading these commodities globally. For cacao, you have about, I think, 60 to 70% of the global trade in cacao beans in the hand of just 4 large companies. For palm oil, maybe it's 3 or 4 companies. For soybean, also, you know, 3 or 4 companies. And so that's the bottleneck of that global trade. So one of the global response to this land use has been quite aggressive naming and shaming campaigns by NGOs, by civil society against these few traders, pushing them to make commitments to have zero deforestation supply chains. That means, some commitment that they will only buy commodities that have not caused deforestation in the production country. Today, more than 500 large multinationals in the agribusiness sectors have made such commitments. And the deadline for implementation, usually it's 2022 or 2030, so it's not right now, but they're working on it. And this has proven a very effective way to control damaging land use in these producing countries by working through what we call supply chain initiatives. So the consumers in the consuming countries, in Europe, in elsewhere, express a preference for sustainable commodities, and this is being transferred through these traders who make these commitments and therefore impose that to the suppliers. And of course, it's extremely complex. First, they need a clear standard, and that's where they largely rely on existing sustainable standards that have been developed by NGOs, like Rainforest Alliance for coffee or cacao, or RSPO, that's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. There's also a Roundtable on Sustainable Soy. So there are all these standards that are international, that have been negotiated with multiple stakeholders. And many of these traders make the commitment that by 2020, by 2030, all they supply will be certified or compliant to these standards. And so that's one way, via global trade, via globalization, where you can try to make these production more sustainable. But of course, and I'm sure half of you are already thinking now in front of your computer, well, this is all greenwashing. And yes, there's been a lot of greenwashing. There's still a lot of attempts to do greenwashing. But that's where the new technologies comes in now. Because when these companies made these commitments, maybe 10 years ago, they thought they could just do a nice website, make nice commitments in international meetings and say, oh, we'll promise we'll do that. And then they didn't work hard on the implementation. But today, there's been huge progress on the Earth observation by satellites. So any of us can see exactly how much forest is being lost at any place in the world. All these data are freely available. There's huge progress on the accessibility of the trade data. There's a beautiful system called TRACE, T-R-A-S-E. You can just type that and go online, and you can trace exactly, the origin of soy production and palm oil and coffee, mostly in Latin America for now. It is a system developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. So that creates a huge amount of transparency. There's enormous progress also on the use of cell phone and drones and other technologies on the ground to really trace exactly what is done by these companies. So now the level of pressure to meet these commitments has increased dramatically. And I will stop here because I don't want to speak too long, but I just say that's just one part of the equation. That's just the global trade part of the equation. And all our research, and that's my lead for Katarina to take over from here, all our research shows that these company commitments are only effective in countries where you have a certain level of governance, where you have created all these enabling conditions, property rights, rule of law, a monitoring system. So there's a whole national scale part of the equation that's really important for these commitments to be effective. And I stop here and I can elaborate after if needed, but I'm sure Katarina knows much better than I do.
I'm actually not sure on that, but you mentioned a lot of points and I was taking notes, and I think I can complement your points with a couple of points from the really national government point of view. And the first thing, what we have seen in countries is, yes, there are unsustainable land uses. Yes, we are losing forest, but that's a discussion among environmentalists, among us that we are in this call. But how can we bring that to high-level political attention? How can we make this a priority for policymakers in countries? And in many countries, there's actually no quantification of what does forest loss mean, what is it in terms of the GDP of the country, how much forest you are losing. And if we then go to finance ministry, so planning ministry, and can tell them it's 3, 4, or 5% of your GDP, or even 0.5, then you have a game changer, because then you can make sure that the discussion on natural resource loss, forest coverage loss, and even soil degradation becomes a priority area, because we are able to express it in terms that finance ministries mostly do dialogue and set priorities, and that is share of GDP. So first point is we need to measure environmental degradation, and we need to put an economic term on it. And there, just on a sideline, also mention we should always include environmental health impact, because in quantifications that can have huge impacts. So for example, air qualities in cities through or also induced by loss of urban forest. There's not always, is it clear what's the relationship, but I do think always include environmental health into your quantifications. A second point I wanted to mention from a governance side, we need to work with countries, with governments on mainstreaming environmental criteria into governance procedures. That is, for example, having green tagging in their national budget, or having environmental criteria in public procurement, because that's where the national investments are channeled. So we need to make sure that public procurement, for example, includes no deforestation criteria, includes sustainable value chains, and that in national procurement and national budget processes, we are actually able to say how much of the national budget is designated to natural resource management or to land use, to land management, because that's the only way then to design proper projects, knowing how much money is actually going there and how much more I need, or what do I actually need to invest. A third point, and I just want to mention it for completeness, but we already discussed it. For local land users, we need to make sure to enhance the value of forest. So we need to deploy instruments such as RED projects that actually compensate for avoided emissions, or payment for environmental services, because that links to another point. A lot of innovative land management techniques, or agroforestry, silvopastoril, they're extremely expensive to set up for a local landowner. So there is, in the short term, an incentive of doing what I do, or doing what's cheapest to do, and not what's best to do. So we need to work with countries on designing programs and policies that help landowners to access resources to overcome the very high setup costs for these new techniques, or to compensate them in any other way that to really make sure economically it makes sense for them. And the last point I wanted to make, and that's connecting very much to what Eric was saying, we need to stronger work with countries, at least in the countries I work in, and with communities on linking them to private sector initiatives. And that's extremely difficult in communally managed forest, because it's not that something comes there and does what he or she wants, whatever, but it's communally managed natural resources. But mostly the things they do are extremely expensive. There's no scale, and it's not so easy connecting them to large companies. So establishing sustainable value chains with these communities and through private sector entities, I think, is one of the key things we should be working on.
Perfect. Thank you very much. A question came to my mind while also you both were talking, but more specifically about the global trade part of the equation that Eric was mentioning. I'm not sure if this makes sense. Eric, would you say that makes sense to think that, for example, you were talking about the few companies that trade cacao, and is it correct to think that the less companies trading this resource, the more concentrated the market, the less constraints at the same time? Would it be easier to manage these stakeholders, and is it?
It's a tricky question, because we know from basic economics that oligopolistic situations, where very few major dominant actors, is not good for business, is not good for this sector, because they can impose low price for the producers, high price for the consumers. They have a very large lobbying power. But one of the only thing that is positive about that in terms of sustainability is that it creates a very large vulnerability of these companies to naming and shaming campaigns. When you only have 2 or 3 big companies, then the specialists, Greenpeace or Mighty Earth, these kind of NGOs, or the more campaigning NGOs, can really mount easily some very effective campaigns on these 2 or 3 actors. And when these 2 or 3 actors make a commitment, you have solved 60% of the problem, because they control 60% of the supply chain. So if you have thousands of small companies involved in the trade, which is the case for other commodities, maybe textile, then you have to campaign each of these companies, and you don't have such a dominant figure in the market. So I'm certainly not saying that oligopolistic situations are good, because every economist in the room would tell me I'm wrong. But it does create that opening for campaigning and for intervention, and these leverage that it can have on a whole sector.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Catarina, would you have something to say about this?
I'm not an expert on the matter. What I think we have seen is we make communities and local landholders extremely vulnerable if their entire incomes depend on one company. And if we have seen enormous failures by extreme pressure on low capacity local landholders not being able to comply with the requirements of large firms. That is the quality of the product, could be wood, could be any other product, but also the timing they need to comply with in order to satisfy the needs of these large companies. So in fact, and coming from that perspective, I would make an argument that it could be, I don't have the much evidence, but it seems to be preferable for small landowners that want to diversify business, want to increase income opportunities, to link to mid-sized companies and not large-sized companies. And that could be an argument against your assumption, I'm not sure, but going into that direction. And second, it seems there is evidence on the ground that it's good for communities to engage with several different firms in order to make sure their income opportunities are sustainable and they can actually learn and enhance their capacity, and not only being the sole provider for one company.
Thank you. Now, we have a question from the audience, from Eve, who asks, would the legal reserve model, meaning preserving 20% to 80% of the area as is done in Brazil, be a viable model for protecting primary forests, so more agriculture in a more sustainable way? I don't know who would like to address the question.
I can start, and Catarina, but first to be precise, so this model, the 80-20% only exists in the Brazilian Amazon, not elsewhere. In the Mato Grosso, it's only 40% or 20% of, I think it's 40% forest, and the rest can be cultivated. Just for the others, so in Brazil, I mentioned the forest code being so well developed in Brazil, and so there is this constraint that if you are a large landowner in the Brazilian Amazon, so more than, I think it's 250 hectares of land, you're obliged to maintain 80% of your land under forest. And think a minute, can you think about any Belgian or British or or I don't know which country you're all from, but in your country, that someone would come and say, okay, you're a farmer, but now you have to keep 80% of your farm and the forest. I think it would be a revolution. But in Brazil, that's part of the law. And just to be complete, there's a small flexibility mechanism that if someone has cleared more than 80% of the forest on their land, they can compensate that by buying a forest credit to another landowner who would have kept more forest on the land. So that facilitates the implementation. So this is working quite well. This is effective, but this is a quite heavy command and control tool, to protect forest. And it's not solving the livelihood issue. It's just the conservation part of the equation. You fence forest, but you are not going to create a sustainable society by fencing nature and keeping people out of nature. You need the other side. You need also to help communities and producers to earn a livelihood, to adopt some sustainable practices, some relatively intensive practice. So on that 20% that's left, they can still earn a living. So I come back to my concept of policy mix. And I think we are trained by a long tradition to always think about one instrument, and talk about just one instrument. But really, what's important is what we call hybrid governance. Public, private, local, international, incentives, threat of sanction, area-based, supply chain intervention. So this whole mix, and how that mix can move a system to a more sustainable state. We did recently a project on all the policies in Colombia to control deforestation, and we identify more than 65 policies that directly we're trying to conserve forest, but either by working on the forestry side or the agriculture side or the livelihood or the education or the monitoring. So that's what we're talking about, 65 different types of intervention that are trying to achieve a goal. And that's what the late Nobel Prize in Economics, Elinor Ostrom, called the polycentric governance. You have multiple centers of governance that are vaguely coordinated, but they are independent. One is by an NGO, one by a municipality, the other one by the country, then by big companies. But they are coordinated. And what you want is that these different interventions to be more or less aligned to achieve the same goal. So to come back to Brazil, to that case, so we have that 80% rule in the Amazon, but we also have the soil moratorium, we also have the cattle agreement, we also have some municipalities that are being blacklisted, we also have a number of other interventions. So together, yes, but you cannot just go there and say, just fence 80% of the forest and then, try to earn a living. That's not my problem.
Thank you. And before I give the floor to Catarina, actually, it's funny that you mentioned Elinor Ostrom. She's the patron of our school. So, but yes, Catarina, any thoughts on this?
Yes, and I actually cannot speak on the Brazilian example, but maybe 3 general points. First of all, it caught my attention that primary forest was mentioned in the question. And I do want to make a point that for many ecosystems, specifically in Central America and Mexico, secondary forest is equally worth protecting because there has been forest management for a lot of time. So what we look at, for example, if you look at Yucatan Peninsula, it's secondary forest. And there was actually recently a change of law that now also protects this natural restoration that can take place in tropical forest. So it's very important, and I think we should not look at primary forest, but really look at the country, at the ecosystems, and look what we actually want to protect or how productive use and restoration interact. A second comment I have, and that's a bit in line with all I said, I do believe we need to empower communities for landscape planning and management because this is the only way we get ownership. So we can have regulation, we can have policies, we can have and we need to have that. We need strong governments to also impose that, but we need to also work bottom up and really empower landowners to look at their land and do that planning and really map out what's conservation, what's agriculture, what's communal use, what's my backyard, and really mapping it out. And because that's the only way they will own it and they will in the long run implement it. And my last point is, and I said that before, when we want to work with communities or landowners on land management, we need to make sure it makes economic sense for them. And it needs to make sense income-wise, livelihood-wise. And we also need to recognize that in many Latin American countries, it's not a conservation area free of people. You have people in all natural protected areas, or at least most of them, and they are dependent on natural resources. They are dependent on using them. They're dependent on certain land uses. So by enhancing conservation area, we need to be mindful of not excluding people from livelihoods, but really making sure to giving them alternatives or empowering them to making their land use sustainable.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have another question from Ingrid, who asks if you could explain a bit more exactly how to engage with local communities.
I go then. I think it depends on the country, and it depends on the cultural and political context. And it's quite different in countries without certain land tenure security than it is with land tenure security. So you have the extreme example, Mexico on the one hand, where there's an agrarian law that recognizes collective land ownership. And you have other countries where it's very different and there's not one common example. What I think it's important is working with governments to engaging with communities. As Eric said, establishing these carrots and sticks in public policy that could incentivize these models. I do think what we need to do on the projects is giving voice and agency. So making sure they are heard, they can be part of policy making. I also think a key factor is looking at minorities or certain interest groups within communities that might not have a voice in their communities because of culture, because of land tenure, that specifically women and young that might not be able to equally participate in their communities, but through interventions at the policy and program level, we can make sure to support social inclusion. And the last element is when we talk about monitoring, about reporting, making sure to deploy tools, and that can be a technical solution that also empower communities for them to monitor their biodiversity, their land use, their activities. The World Bank has deployed a series of tools, most recently for communal progress monitoring. And that works offline, so for communities to really report the progress of their projects, but there are many other tools. And there is in fact a very good example that spans from Mexico to Panama, where there was a specific action on empowering communities for biodiversity monitoring. Has been highly successful, and that's including bird watching, recollecting samples of soil, of forest, of other things, and that really making sure that we create that ownership on the ground.
And I would just add to that, there's a big difference whether you deal with indigenous communities or long established communities with a very strong social cohesion, a very solid local environmental knowledge. So in that case, I think it's quite obvious how you enter, in that collaboration, because you already have these local institutions. Where it becomes much, much more difficult is when you deal with a situation with migrant communities that come from many different places, kind of colonist where you get to a place and then every household comes from a different state, for a different province. They've migrated there recently. So you don't have that social cohesion. You don't have that trust of these local social networks or this local leadership. And you don't even have the local environmental knowledge because they've migrated there maybe just this generation. And so that's really where it becomes much, much more difficult to engage communities, because you need to start by some level of education, and you need to start by creating the local institutions through which you could work.
Great, thank you. Now, I just also have a question that just came up. Whether about your future projects or any upcoming projects coming up, and whether you have any that include the aspect of animal welfare in the picture of sustainable land use. Yeah, Katarina or Eric? Katarina first.
Yeah, it's a tough question for me. I don't think I'm fully competent on responding that, but I do think that enhanced or integrated landscape management techniques would also mainstream that aspect. And in fact, what we see, and that's maybe from a very biased perspective I have on the countries I'm currently engaged in, as we stronger focus on indigenous and local knowledge, as we make sure to deploy traditional techniques that have been within these communities for centuries, we not only increase the welfare of these communities, but also the overall environment and anything that comes with it.
Yes, and again, a global scale answer to that question is that basically the only way to really respect fully animal welfare is just to stop eating animal products altogether, because any form of exploitation of animals as a technology to produce meat or whatever is a form of, it's exploitative. You know, it just and you know, we see this trend, and now, you know, the agribusiness is an industry that propose on the market some products that make it very, very easy to be vegan and still, you know, meet all the nutritious need. But also on that topic, I would like to come back to the very first question you asked, where I was talking about intensification of livestock operation. If we are going to eat meat, of course, the best way to respect animal welfare are these very extensive systems, where you just let these animals roam into a, you know, in some very large range. But these are also the ones that are the worst in terms of land use. You know, they consume a lot of land. They cause a lot of deforestation. So the very solution that I myself was proposing to intensify livestock operation is the worst thing you could do in terms of animal welfare, because that means stabulation, animal feed, and a much more intensive model of production. So that's why I think when you bring that to the equation, the only logical conclusion is to move away quickly from meat. And again, you know, there are all these options that are today available.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I would like to open now for Eric and Katarina and ask if you guys have any other comments you want to make before we close the discussion. Maybe some final words from both of you about some takeaways or important considerations after all these discussions and about how complex and there's so many different perspectives that we have to look at in order to create the correct incentives to design the projects and policies that actually work. So do you have any considerations?
If I may start, I think you've all seen that if you're interested in that field of land use management, you need to embrace complexity. I think that was present throughout the conversation, you know, from Katarina's graph on the landscape approach to my concept of policy mixes and multiple stakeholders. So if you look for simplicity, don't work in that field, you know. But if you're ready to embrace the world multi stakeholders, multiple approach, multiple ecosystem services, multiple scales, and if you like to bring clarity to a very complex coupled human environment system, I think that's a great field. But it also requires nuance. As you've seen in our answer, we never said it's black or it's white. You know, we always said, well, you know, it's complicated, it depends, and we need this and that and that. So this is, I'm afraid that a lot of the decision makers in private business and public policies are not trained to embrace complexity, nuances, and have the communication skills to convince the constituents that that's how we need to approach this problem. So I think that's a very important aspect in your field, you know, just to agree that it's not a black or white solution. You know, it's a complex one.
And there, to complement on what Eric says, I do think I would encourage you, wherever you are and whatever you plan to do, is it research, international organizations, think tanks, you need to go to the field. You need to talk to people. Because one thing is the theory we can explain to you, but there's nothing that can really substitute you talking to a farmer and asking them how it works for you. How much do they pay you for beans or tomatoes? Because that will give you a sense what's the real life problem of these people. And that would be the only way that we all together in the future, hopefully, can design policies that actually address the needs of the poorest and most marginalized. And if you do not have the field experience, you won't ever have that view. You will not be able to integrate that. So I know it's not possible right now, but as soon as you can, I do think travel to any country that you like, but really go to the field.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We're super happy to have this discussion and would like to thank both of our guests, of course, everyone who is watching, and Professor Carlos Closa. The Latin America Focus Group is delighted to host these discussions that have, of course, the potential to help all of us to visualize better solutions for the governance problems that Latin America region faces, and we are already excited for our next event. Please check out our website. The link is in the description of this video. And please, if you are interested, just follow our next events and publications on the website, because we for sure have many interesting things upcoming. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so I think we log out here. You still have the audience probably, yeah?
Offline, Roberto? You're actually not